Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, we are going to talk about application of post-colonial studies. Post-colonialism, the historical period or state of affairs representing the aftermath of Western colonialism. The term can also be used to describe the concurrent project to reclaim and rethink the history and agency of people subordinated under various forms of imperialism. Post-colonial literature is the literature by people from formerly colonized countries. It addresses the role of literature in perpetuating and challenging what post-colonial critic Edward Said refers to the cultural imperialism. So, post-colonial literature characteristics, appropriation of colonial languages, post-colonial writers have this thing they like to do. Meta-narrative, colonizers like to tell a certain story. Colonialism, colonial discourse, rewriting history, decolonization struggles, nationhood and nationalism, valorization of cultural identity, counter discourse, challenging stereotypes we are going to discuss as an application of post colonial theories. So we have already studied that what does this word post colonial means, and we have talked about in detail. The field of post colonial study has been gaining prominence since the 1970s, since some would, due to rise in the Western Academy from the publication of Edward Said's influenced critique of Western constructions of the Orient in 1978 book Orientalist. The growing currency, with an Academy of term post-colonial, sometimes hyphenated, was consolidated by the appearance of 1969, the Empire Writes Back theory, and the practice of the post-colonial literature by Bill Ashcroft and drifting since then the use of the this term commonwealth and third world, so all these things we people have discussed in previous lecture too, that what does this word, so it's a sort of a recap, you can remember it, that lot of important writers, critics who worked on it, they produced a lot of things on post-colonial studies, that what does this word mean. So major issues that post-colonialism address. Despite the reservations and debates, research and postcolonial study has continued to grow because postcolonial critique allows for a wide-ranging investigation into power relations in various contexts, the formation of empire, the impact of colonization, and the post-colonial history, economy, science, and culture, the culture production of colonized societies, feminisms, and post-colonialism agency for marginalized people, and the state of post-colony in contemporary economic and cultural context, capitalism and the market, environmental concerns, and the relationship between aesthetics and politics and literature are some of the more important topics in the field that we people study in colonialism. How people are subjugated, how their economy is impacted, feminism. So a lot of things are there. We people discuss a lot of theories. Post-colonialism, colonial theories actually. That does not mean only one theory. There can be set of theory. But after Derrida's deconstruction, we can see a train of theories there that all talking and criticizing colonialism. It's basically reaction to colonialism. Post-colonialism does not mean that comes after it. It can be literally true, but so far as semantically, if we can talk about it, and from critical thinking, from criticism point of view, if we talk about it, it is something different one, that it's a reaction to colonialism and liberation from the impacts of colonial thinking, whatever we people have, it comes into the umbrella term of post-colonial studies or theories. So a lot of the questions are there. How did the experience of colonization affect those who were colonized, while also influencing the colonizers? How were colonial powers able to gain control over a large portion of the northwestern world? What factors have been left by colonial education, science, and technology in post-colonial societies? How do these factors affect the decisions about development and modernization? in post colonies? What were the forms of resistance against colonial control? How did colonial education and language influence the culture and identity of the colony? How did Western science, technology, and medicine change existing knowledge system? What are the emergent forms of post colonial identity after departure of the colonizers? To what extent has decolonization reconstruction free from colonial influence been possible, or Western formulation of post colonialism overemphasizing hybridity at the expense of material reality? Should decolonization proceed through an aggressive return to the pre colonial past? Related topic essentialism. How do gender, race, and class function in colonial and post colonial discourses? Are new forms of imperialism replacing colonization, and how? So, these are a lot of questions, and this whole slide is regarding questions that need to be answered one in current world. So, main goals of post-colonial studies. The ultimate goal of post-colonial is accounting for and combating the residual effects of colonialism on culture. It's not simply concerned with salvaging past worlds, but learning how the world can move beyond this period to gather towards a place of mutual respect. Bhabha, especially known for its discussion of cultural hybridity. Other major concepts and themes in post-colonial theory are power, subjectivity, identity, ethnicity, race, and nation. So we have to see application of post-colonial studies as possible working definition for post-colonialism is that it involves a studied engagement with the experience of colonialism and its past and present effects, both at the local level of ex-colonial societies and at the level of more general global development, thought to be the after effects of the empire. This changes the socio-cultural, socio-economic, and demographic factors. Meta-narrative colonizers like to tell a certain story, and this story Europeans were treated to rule over other lesser people, from the Irish to the Igbo. Europeans were the designated master, the rulers of the earth. Therefore, they were justified in ruling over others, but that was their destiny. And anyway, they weren't really in it for their own profit. They were enlightening the darker peoples. You see, they were civilizing them. So, post colonial writers have a big problem with this story. After all, from the perspective, colonization wasn't about civilization or enlightenment, it was about brutal economic exploitation. And what really bothers them is the fact that this story was told and repeated by the colonizers as thought it was a fact. Europeans wanted everyone, including their colonized subjects, to accept it as true. So, post-colonial writers started pointing out that actually there is more than one side to the story. In fact, there are often loads of different sides to the same story, as a story that we take to be true or factual is often just one point of view among many. So, in their own work, post-colonial writers tend to play around the jargon narrative. They like to draw attention to the way the stories or narratives are constructed, and especially how they are always told from a certain point of view or angle. So, for many cultures around the world, colonialism was a massively traumatic thing. Imagine all of a sudden this stranger shows up in your town and your village, takes all your stuff, forces you to learn his language only to tell you how lame you are, and then proceeds to run things any way he wants. Oh, and just add a little thing in the exploitation cake. He does uh, all this while destroying your environment, your culture, and your livelihood. In fact, the effects of colonialism were so deep that even after indispensable, many countries and cultures continue to suffer from its effects. Often, the colonizers' language displaced indigenous languages. Many people abandoned indigenous religions after being converted to Christianity by missionaries. Even the post colonial nations that emerged after independence were Modeled alone Western style European nations with the same type of administration and bureaucratic setup. So, given what a huge deal colonialism was, is it any wonder what writers from formerly colonized countries became obsessed with understanding it, representing it, and challenging it? And given that consequences of colonialism extended well beyond the actual period of decolonizations, a lot of people say that these consequences continue even to this day. So, is it any wonder that the writers are still dealing with the legacy of colonialism? Discourse is a collection of narratives, statements, and opinions dealing with a certain topic. Discourse can be about anything. There is even Justin Bible discourse. If you think about all these millions of articles, gossip columns, and Twitter need feeds obsessing over when he last blinked his left eye. Colonial discourse, as you might guess, is the collection of narratives, statements, opinion that deals with colonized people, told from the perspective of European colonizers. Of course, the discourse isn't very kind to colonized people. It usually portrays them as savages, as uncivilized, as lazy, and as servants. Colonizers themselves are usually presented as civilized and benevolent and generous. So, given that colonial discourse was so important in justifying the whole enterprise of colonialism, it became very important theme for post-colonial writers. One of the goals of post-colonial writers is to attack this colonial discourse and show it up for what is land of gold. So, European colonizers often thought that the people that they colonized didn't have a history before the Europeans enlightened them. The colonizers thought that the colonized people had no culture, but had made no contribution to human progress and were ignorant from what perspective colonialism was a wonderful thing for them. Weren't they just so lucky to be taken out of their thing for them? Ignorance and darkness and civilized by benevolent colonizers. Post colonial writers don't like this version of history. It's a version that cast colonizers as heroes and rescued who saved everyone from ignorance and darkness. So post colonial writers set about writing history from their own perspective and show how colonialism was actually a pretty violent, terrible thing. More importantly, these writers also show how history is a matter of perspective, and there are always many perspectives. There is no one true history. Decolonization struggles, freedom fighters in Africa, Asia, America, and Caribbean fought colonialism. People like Mahatma Gandhi in India, Patricia Loma in Zaire, and Cabral in Cape Verde, and Suomi in Haiti tackled the colonial powers through politics. Without them, decolonization couldn't have happened, but decolonization is just a political thing. It's also cultural and mental thinking. There are the writers coming. Post colonial writers aren't just interested in decolonizing the political subject, they are interested in decolonizing the mind, to use a phrase made famous by the post colonial Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Decolonizing the mind means different things and different writers, but there is also pain, mental and cultural liberation from the structure of philosophies and colonies. Post-colonial writers are really interested in nationhood and colonialism. A lot of these writers are very patriotic. The writers books on behalf of their nations. Their writer is often nationalist because post-colonial writers like to highlight and valorize their nation's culture, political, and social identity. Now, things didn't turn out so well from many countries after they gained independence, whether it was corrupt politicians or general lack of democracy. The problems were huge, and post-colonial writers got mad. Post-colonial literature isn't just about criticizing the colonial powers; it's about criticizing the native corruption that betrayed the dreams of newly liberated nations. Valorization of cultural identity, you know how big a justification for colonialism was. Basically, that the culture of colonized people were just inferior to those of Europeans. Well, post colonial writers challenged this idea and they do this by valorizing their own indigenous culture. You have got religion. They say to the colonizers, so do we. You have got culture, so do we. We have got our own literature and our own art, from sculpture to painting to body painting dudes. So in post-colonial literature, you also see this valorization of cultural identity reflected in the narrative style of literary work. For example, a lot of African post-colonial literature resembles spoken language. That's because prior to colonialism, much African literature was oral literature. People told stories, they sang poetry to each other. So, no one way that African writers valorized their indigenous heritage by turning back to these oral narratives forms that predated colonization for inspiration. Counter discovery, if there is one characteristic that we could use to lump together all these different literatures emerging from all over the world, it is that they form part of counter discourse to colonialism. Remember how we define colonial discourse and as a collection of narrative statements and opinions generated by colonizers about the colonized. Well, counter discourse is, you guessed it, the collection of narrative statements, opinions that post-colonial writers generate in opposition to the colonial discourse. In the counter discourse of post colonial writers, we'll find beliefs such as the white people are the best, Africans are lazy, and Asians are stupid, contradicted again and again. That's because such ideas and statements form the foundation of colonial discourse, and that was made up to justify the economic exploitation of the colonized people. Challenging stereotypes in order to justify colonialism, colonizers had to make themselves believe that the people they are colonizing were somehow lesser than they were. Otherwise, how could they got off and enslave and kill and steal from so many people? One way they convinced themselves of their superiority was by developing all kinds of stereotypes about different colonized groups. They were dangerous, they were untrustworthy, they were lazy. A big mission of post-colonial writers is to challenge these stereotypes and show that they were based on nothing but the biases of the colonizers. Sociocultural factors. Phenomena post-colonial is a critical theory which aims to study the process of colonization from perspective to the colonized societies. Post-colonialism comes into play into socio situation which concerns the nation's culture after the liberation from imperial power. Post-colonial is a style of thinking as the colonized and the colonizers, as well as methodological tools for analysis of post-colonial discourse, its myths and history, language and discourse, selves and others. Homi K. Bhabha is a leader of the direction of post-colonial studies and author of numerous neologism, hybridity, mimicry. Hybridity is a term used by Homi K. Bhabha to describe and explaining the ontological status of cultural objects generated in the course of convergence of European and the colonial traditions in the age of globalizations. Homi K. Bhabha focused on translations as a means of cultural transfer. In the post-colonial era of multiculturalism, in his view, a translator thus speaks several languages, is much multicultural. However, Homi K. Bhabha did not conclude the translation of the hybridity, but regards the process of interlingual and intercultural transfer as a way of hybrid semantic codes and actualizing their semantic verbal preparation uh, in different socio cultural situation of the largest country. Linguistically, the text of the Homike Baba is monograph. The location of culture is a typical example of humanitarian scientific function style where the primary cognitive internationality realized at the lexical and grammatical levels. So, colonial languages were the languages of politics, which meant that a lack of fluency was a natural barrier preventing many colonizers from gaining politics and power. Language played a critical role in the form of colonialism, making a cultural claim to conceptual lands, not just a political one. Socioeconomic factors in immense economic inequality we observe the world today didn't happen overnight. So a lot of socioeconomic factors had been in. The major reason is colonialism. Colonialism has changed. So we can see European colonialism retracing over 500 years or back. The verge of the colonialism changed. Everything was changed. So linguistic factors are also there. Language is also central question post-colonial studies. During colonization, colonizers usually imposed on every encouraged the dominance of the native language to the people. So during colonization, colonizers usually imposed their language onto people, and they were supposed to follow it. So colonial languages were the language of politics, which were dominant, which were spoken, and people who knew them, they were given jobs and power. So, major other some of the other best known names in post colonial literature are those of Chinua Achebe, Homi Bhabha, Edward Said, and Buchi Mbixita, Franz Fanon, Jamaica, Kinsey, Salman Rushdie, Vol Soyinka, and Gay Chakravorty Spivak. So, literature, Chinua Achebe, and so these are the writers who worked on post-colonial literature, and these are the people who worked in film, and these are the people who worked in theory you can study. So conclusion: post-colonial studies study the hybridity, socio-cultural factors, socio-economic factor, linguistic factor, appropriation of colonial languages, meta-narrative, colonialism, colonial discourse, writing history, decolonization struggles, nationhood, nationalism, valorization of cultural identity, counter discourse, challenging stereotypes of the societies. Thank you.